afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Gas Resource Management meeting to discuss straw proposal scoping and alignment. My name is Christina Guimara, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating today's meeting. I'm joined by Sylvie and Danny. Before we get started, just a quick reminder that the materials related to this meeting are available on the initiative page. You can get to that page by going to kaiso.com and then navigating to the Stakeholder Center tab at the top. And then you can select policy initiatives, which will take you to our main initiative landing page. And from there, you'll be able to navigate to the initiative page. And the latest documents are always at the top of the page. Next slide, please. This call is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Just a reminder to keep comments professional and respectful and refrain from repeating what has already been said so we can manage our time efficiently. Next slide, please. To ask questions during the meeting, you can open the participant and chat panels on the bottom right, and you can then raise your hand by selecting the raise hand icon, or if you joined audio only, please press *3 on your device. And please remember to state your name and affiliation first before speaking. And you can also send your comments and questions via chat to all panelists if you're having trouble with the raise hand function. Next slide, please. And with that, I will turn it over to Sylvie to get us started.
Thank you, Christina, and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining this afternoon for the Gas Resource Management Working Group on Scoping and Alignment. Let me begin off by just getting ourselves oriented here. Progress to date. In January, we published a Gas Resource Management issue paper. The goal of this issue paper was to detail all of the potential approaches for policy development that we heard coming out of the working group and the working group recommended action plan. Then the ISO asked for stakeholder feedback to narrow the scope from all of the different things that we had initially heard to what we think are priorities for near-term policy development. So at this point, we've received those comments and synthesized them into what we think represents the top priorities for this group. And I'd like to use this call to get alignment. Before we go ahead and publish the straw proposal, I'd like to make sure that the scope based on stakeholder identified priorities is an accurate reflection of what you intended in your comments, and that the timeline for development is reasonable based on some expected next steps that we see. Let's go to the next slide. Goals for today. I've also put what your homework assignment is going to be at the front, just to give you a guidepost on what to pay attention to and look out for. So as we go through this, what I'll do is review the policy development objectives that I saw highlighted by stakeholders in their comments, and I'll pull out the approaches that I saw most stakeholders identified as preferred near-term priorities. And we'll open up the comment template to make sure you have an opportunity to tell us if these are the right priorities, to indicate if we have an alignment, or if maybe scope is missing something that you'd like to make sure we address in the near term. Because we want to be cognizant about how much time you have and other competing priorities, I've also identified some potential next steps and described the process for developing the stakeholder identified proposals that we saw in comments. So this should give you an opportunity to tell us if this is reasonable, if this is a reasonable lift for stakeholder engagement in the near term, or if we can use more or less time to talk about these things. I'll also provide an opportunity for us to discuss the parking lot. So things that we had initially talked about in the working group process, but didn't get elevated as a priority in the recent comment period. And you'll have an opportunity to tell us if any of those scope items should be reconsidered in the near term. So that's the game plan for today. Let's dive into what we saw and what we think is going to be in the straw proposal. Go to the next slide. So what I saw in stakeholder comments was pretty good alignment over a set of focused objectives. These are the three areas that we've been talking about throughout the working group process and in the issue paper. And within each of these areas, stakeholders have recommended a specific approach for how we should be spending our time in policy development this year. So on the topic of informing fuel procurement, we've been discussing this idea of doing an assessment of the D+2 market run, the market run before the day ahead market, and working on coordinating the D+2 market run to deliver more accurate results. Stakeholders recommended that we build on that approach that we've talked about previously from the issue paper and continue to assess the inputs into this market run and what model assumptions are made. Stakeholders would also like to talk about what additional information can come from this market run that might be valuable for fuel procurement multiple days out. On the next topic, we've been talking about accommodating gas price. Oh, can we go back a slide? Accommodating gas price volatility and reference level changes. So what we heard here is that most stakeholders actually want to focus on defining and accommodating exceptional circumstances instead of broad changes. And we've also gotten some proposals for design changes that can streamline the automated cost adjustment process. And then the last category is gas burn limitations, or OFOs. And this one's a little bit different. And I'll take a somewhat different approach to discussing what we're doing here and how we're getting there. We actually got a number of very specific proposals to capture gas burn limitations as a price signal in electric market price formation. There are a number of challenges that we still need to overcome to get there. So what I've done here is created a game plan to address the immediate stakeholder requests for information and transparency, and also systematically consider what we need to do in order to get to a phase where developing these stakeholder proposals in full is feasible. So that's the overview. Let's dive into D+2. Go to the next slide. All right, informing fuel procurement. We can go to the next slide. Stakeholder identified objectives for informing fuel procurement. I've distilled these from all of your comments. Stakeholders would like to improve market participants' ability to anticipate fuel targets and align fuel procurement with market awards, and in doing so, reduce unhedged exposure to operational uncertainty. A second goal, and I think that this is newly highlighted, is that our efforts should support economic participation for EIM-only market participants and ensure equitable treatment of day-ahead and real-time entities in our policy development priorities. So keeping these two objectives in mind, the way we're going to go about this is through considering the D+2 accuracy assessment and D+2 coordination. And together, those two pieces will tell us if we need to invest time in more significant changes. Let's go to the next slide. So in the D+2 accuracy assessment, we've talked about this before, fairly straightforward. The goal here is to assess the difference between D+2 to day ahead, or the IFM, and D+2 to real time. And the goal of this assessment is to improve confidence in using D+2 results as fuel procurement targets during the timely gas nomination cycle when you're procuring fuel and there's a lot more liquidity. The other main goal of doing this assessment is to reveal opportunities where we can improve D+2 alignment with the day-ahead and real-time markets. And that will support a third goal, which I've identified as a future goal, which is identifying market inputs that can be improved by more contemporaneous information via a new market run. So I'll talk a little bit more about that new market run before we go to the next category, but I see this as a building process. Let's go to the next slide. The issue paper asked for feedback in this specific area because we had been talking about using the D+2 accuracy assessment to satisfy the objective of improving confidence in these results for fuel procurement. So we want to make sure that all market participants, including regional market participants, feel confident in using these results. Today, the D+2 generates advisory results just for day-ahead participating entities. So today that's just CAISO BA resources. The question that we posed to stakeholders was, can we extrapolate how accurate these D+2 results will be for new day-ahead market participants, so non-CAISO BA resources, if we're just looking at an assessment of D+2 today or historical D+2 results? So we put this question out to you guys, and what we heard is that stakeholders do generally see a value in continuing with this assessment based on CAISO BA resources. And we heard some specific requests that the ISO provide more detail around the inputs and assumptions that we use in the D+2 to inform feedback. Let's go to the next slide. So I think we feel confident in moving forward with diving into this analysis. And I would encourage this group to engage further in how we develop this analysis and discuss the findings. We did get some preliminary specific recommendations with respect to the previous question. So PAC says that a direct comparison won't necessarily be helpful because base scheduling practices will be too different from how the market will optimize day-ahead schedules. SRP said that more clarity around how EIM market participants are accounted for in the D+2 might be helpful. And from a number of stakeholders, we heard that breaking down the assessment into discrete inputs will be valuable. So we'll take these recommendations and run with it and incorporate it into the D+2 assessment that we have started for the straw proposal. Let's go to the next slide. A couple of things that we've already identified and talked about either in the issue paper or the last call are a couple of potential metrics that we've gone ahead and started to assess. Daily average gas burn in the D+2 compared to the day ahead market for CAISO BA resources. D+2 compared to the day ahead market awards, again for CAISO BA resources. And differences in net forecasting and net forecasting error, once again for CAISO BA resources. We got some stakeholder recommended additions that I want to take a moment to talk about. First, one stakeholder recommended that we add a real-time comparison to this base analysis. So compare the D+2 to real-time for gas burn, megawatt hour market awards, and net load forecasting error. I do want to note that that will continue to be for CAISO BA resources, and that's because we can't compare EIM only real-time results to anything day ahead because we don't necessarily have it. Another recommendation that we got was to identify and focus on different periods like stress conditions, pipeline restrictions, or specific weather events. So we thought about going ahead to try and get the ball rolling internally by identifying some of these periods, but I think that this will tie into the policy development process more broadly when we start to talk about exceptional circumstances. And so I'll continue to leave the door open for stakeholders to give us some specific recommendations on what we should look at, what sort of details you need to build confidence in these results and to help us identify when they may not be as accurate. So I'll move on to D+2. If everyone is set on what is coming on D+2 accuracy assessment, we can talk about the coordination efforts. Go to the next slide. The goal of D+2 coordination efforts will be to align the D+2, and I put DX in parentheses. That means D plus a different number, so potentially D+3, D+4, to align that multi-day ahead market run as closely as possible with the next day's day-ahead market run. And the purpose of doing this is to produce data that's valuable to you for planning, anticipating fuel needs, and managing operational uncertainty, and reducing the potential for unhedged gas procurement based on those D+2 advisory schedules. Again, these are the objectives that I pulled out from the stakeholder comments. So anytime you provide feedback or additions to this. Moving forward, these efforts are going to include developing enhancements to the market model and talking about the assumptions that it makes, and identifying the market outputs that might be valuable to support fuel procurement decisions. So I've got a couple of examples of proposals that we've already gotten from stakeholders that will be incorporated into the straw proposal. Let's go to the next slide. So here I want to discuss how there are different possible processes for this. There's basically two buckets of potential areas to potential proposals. First is thinking about the modeling enhancements. And under thinking about the modeling enhancements, this is where we'll capture considerations and potential enhancements that can be done in the near term and also maybe through a BPM process, something that can be implemented with EDAM Go Live. The policy bucket is a group of considerations where we think that these will warrant more stakeholder discussion in the context of a policy initiative and might require a tariff change. So the examples that we got so far, under modeling assumptions, PAC has recommended a different way to use bids. So today, we use historic bids from 7 days prior to the relevant trade day. And I have an example here, just in case it's not clear, that we're using historic bids from the same day of the week, but 1 week prior. So imagine the D+2 is running today for real time that occurs on Friday. For the D+2 today, we would use bids that were submitted for the real-time market on 4/11, so Friday of last week. PAC's recommendation here is to use submitted bids for the relevant trade day if available and previous days if not. In other words, if the D+2 is being run today for real-time on Friday, we would use bids that have been submitted for day ahead tomorrow and real-time on Friday already. And if bids haven't been submitted for those market processes already, then we would use the previous days. In the straw proposal, we will provide more details around the different inputs and modeling assumptions and welcome additional recommendations like this one. Then in the policy scope, this is something that's in the tariff, which is why it indicates to me that we'll need to have some policy discussions around these types of recommendations. And I've got an example here, or an example in the next couple of slides. So in the tariff, we say that scheduling coordinators for gas resources that are participating in the day-ahead market may receive 2 day-ahead advisory schedules through CMRI. PAC has recommended that we expand the advisory horizon to include future days like the D+3 to better align with gas trading timeline. You might need information in the D+3 to procure fuel for hours ending in 1 through 7 in real time. PAC also recommended that we provide LMPs in addition to advisory schedules. And SDG&E recommended that we provide resource-specific gas burn information in MMBTUs. And it's this last one that I want to discuss a little bit further, and it'll show you why some of these discussions might be a little bit more involved in the policy process. Let's go to the next slide. So I want to be really clear about how gas burn is calculated and what the implications of that is, given our objective of the D+2 assessment and coordination effort, providing useful and accurate information. So today, the ISO calculates gas burn based on a megawatt output level, and it's an approximation. First, a scheduling coordinator submits information through GRDT, and that's stored in the master file, and that forms an average heat rate curve. The ISO uses that scheduling coordinator submitted average heat rate curve to then calculate or extrapolate an incremental heat rate at a given operational point. So to envision what this looks like, we take the heat rate curve. You have two average heat rates, and the change between those segments gives you the incremental heat rate. We use this for DEBs. DEBs include this approximate incremental heat rate calculated based on the average heat rate, and importantly, that includes a 110% multiplier to account for differences between this ISO calculation, which is necessarily an approximation, and precise resource parameters. Let's go to the next slide. So when we were talking internally about this recommendation that the ISO provide gas burn that is associated with the advisory schedules, it raised a couple of flags for us, not because of the implementation effort, but because it's an approximation. Scheduling coordinators or resource managers may have better and more precise information. Advisory schedules that are published to CMRI are an output of the market, so that's dollars per megawatt hour, and the market doesn't optimize or output gas burn. So in order to get this to happen, we would take those advisory schedules, and instead of publishing them straight to CMRI, we would put them into a different calculation. And that calculation would use output from the master file to give us an approximation of gas burn that's based on the average gas burn that a scheduling coordinator submitted to the ISO. So this process is feasible, but as you can see, it's a multi-step process that gets us a little bit farther from what's precise. And our concern is that this approximation could be misleading if you're using it as a direct indicator of fuel procurement. Let's go to the next slide. So this is just an example that I pulled from the BPM to more clearly illustrate what's going on. This chart on your left is an example of what a resource might submit to the master file. The scheduling coordinator is responsible for defining operational points. We have a minimum of Pmin and Pmax, but then you can define up to, I think, 11 operational points. And then for each of those segments, the scheduling coordinator defines the operational level or megawatt output, and then the average heat rate at that operational level. And so that is shown on the graph to your right. As the blue curve, the average heat rate curve. The pink and the green curves are then what the ISO calculates to come up with an incremental heat rate. I'll let that sink in for a second. Any questions about this?
I'm not seeing any hands raised at this moment, Schulte.
Okay. Let's go to the next slide. So at this point, we're not taking this off the table, but we do want to hear back from stakeholders how we should consider this. There are two options. One, we can keep it in scope and talk about it further through the policy process. The second is that we can scope it out. If we keep it in scope, here are some of the potential questions that might come up during the policy process. First, it might be useful to know if the heat rate information that resources submit or that the scheduling coordinator for a gas generator submits is sufficiently precise for this purpose. Policy today doesn't use this information for something that necessitates a precise output. So we want to make sure that scheduling coordinators know that what they're inputting is being used for a specific output. Another question is, does this approximation that's based on an average heat rate curve, or is this approximation valuable for informing your fuel purchases? Especially if you compare that to what a resource manager could feasibly back out of megawatt hour schedules using what they know of more dynamic and precise market as operating parameters. Assuming we're still all systems are go on this idea, A final question that we might consider is if we should think about a separate process or a different methodology that might provide resource level gas burn based on advisory schedules in a more precise manner. So you can see that something that seems like a fairly innocuous ask is actually more of a policy question. So we'll be putting this out there for stakeholder comments after this call, but I'll take a pause to see if anyone wants to comment on this now.
I'm not seeing any questions coming in at this moment.
Okay, if you think of any, let us know. I know this was a popular idea during the working group process, and it did get endorsements in the last round of comments, so I want to make sure it gets its due consideration. Let's go to the next slide. Great. So before moving on to the next category, I do want to get alignment on the idea of putting the D plus 1.5 in the parking lot. So as a reminder, the D plus 1.5 is this proposal to add a new market run after the D plus 2, but before the day ahead market to take advantage of potentially new and more accurate information. So I think that there is broad agreement that focusing on the D plus 2 assessment and coordination in the near term will provide a lot of value and get us closer to our goals. We did hear from NVE specifically to keep this in scope because it would provide a better estimate of the next day's market results as the potential to reduce reliability concerns and realize consumer savings. But I think we need a lot more information in order to get us there, in order to identify what inputs are going to benefit from new information and how we should shape this new market run. So while we support a continued consideration of this new market run, we think it should be after we complete an assessment of the D plus 2 and have some operational experience with the extended day ahead market and the new D plus 2 market run. So at this time, we don't intend on including the D plus 1.5 proposal in this proposal in detail. Let us know if you disagree with this approach.
I'm not seeing any questions coming in at this moment.
All right, then let's go to the next topic. We can go to the next slide. Accommodating cost variation. Move on to the next slide. All right, let's start with the objectives that we saw in recent stakeholder comments. Stakeholders said that policy should incentivize resources to procure gas at least cost and act prudently. This is reflected in the issue paper as well. We heard from stakeholders that resources should have an incentive to come to the table to provide accurate cost information to ensure that they are dispatched economically, even in uncompetitive conditions. A click down or corollary to this principle, I guess, is that the design of the cost adjustment process itself shouldn't impede generators' ability or incentive to provide that updated information to the market. I think that's a nice way of saying that it's worth looking at the process and investing in streamlining it to make sure you have the ability to do this. Finally, and this is more of a new objective that I heard from a number of stakeholders, resources should be able to recover expenses that are accrued during intraday gas purchases or made outside active fuel zones under extreme conditions. In other words, resources should be able to recover exceptional expenses in exceptional circumstances. And that is the direction that a lot of stakeholder proposals moved in. So let's talk about those. Next slide. Most stakeholder recommendations in this area focus on the idea of exceptional circumstances. So just to level set, exceptional circumstances describes a circumstance in which market participants have faced challenges or expect to face challenges managing gas price volatility and gas purchases. Today, we actually have some of these policies that we talked about in the issue paper call, where when there's information available and accessible to the ISO, we might be able to use that to indicate an exceptional event and indicate that we should trigger some exceptional process. For example, the ISO keeps an eye on same-day gas prices. And if those gas prices exceed the next day gas day index by a certain amount, we increase the reasonableness threshold. Another example is when we receive 3 manual reference level change requests at a certain hub. That is information that is given to us by market participants, and the ISO uses that to indicate that there's been a physical disruption of some kind at that hub, and that triggers additional bidding flexibility for resources that are mapped to that hub. So it sounds like a lot of stakeholders like the direction that this is moving in, and have advocated for focusing on defining exceptional circumstances, finding an observable trigger, and developing enhancements. So here are some examples of what I saw in stakeholder feedback. Exceptional circumstances might be defined as something that's hub specific or regional, or maybe a market-wide event. It could be a resource specific arrangement, or it could be due to physical disruptions, maintenance, and outages. So we'll want to talk about if we need to focus on one of these or all of these. As a first step, define exceptional circumstances. Next, and potentially more difficult, is figuring out what an observable trigger would be. So this could be something that's based on gas market conditions or information that we receive from a gas operator. It could be weather or forecast based, or information that we get from market participants or the ISO's market itself. Finally, we will need to develop enhancements that make it easier for market participants to manage this gas price volatility or whatever other condition we've identified. And this could include providing additional flexibility for bidding, or creating carve-outs, exemptions, or alternative options to today's cost adjustment process. So I've offered this here and now as a sort of rubric to start for stakeholders to start thinking about what's going to go into this process, and potential recommendations. Let's go to the next slide. I would almost say that we have a great straw proposal already here, entirely of stakeholder proposed recommendations from the last round of comments. So I'll go through them quickly, and if any of these is your proposal, feel free to jump in and talk about it. And if you'd like to work with us to add some detail for the straw proposal, or you're interested in presenting, please let us know. So here's some of the things that I've pulled out from comments to date. The first proposal is a weather-triggered scarcity protocol that would temporarily adjust the reasonableness threshold value. So the observable trigger would be something weather-related, and the enhancement would be a new threshold value that we need to determine. Next, develop a proxy GPI value when the weighted average index price is unavailable. So our exceptional circumstances here is the unavailability of an index price, which can happen on Mondays and also during intraday gas cycles. Heard some ideas for modifications to the manual reference level change request process. Probably need to do some more thinking in here to make sure it's feasible, and under what conditions we might want to create some leniency in timelines or process. The next one I think is interesting because it reflects one of the processes that we already do but takes a slightly different approach. So today I mentioned that when we receive 3 manual reference level change requests at a hub, that indicates to the ISO that there's some physical disruption that we don't already know about. And so we give stakeholders more bidding flexibility, or we give market participants at that hub more bidding flexibility. This stakeholder proposal says, in addition to that, we'd also like to make sure there are alternate cost recovery processes just in case the timeline for cost adjustments has already passed. And the last recommendation here is the negotiated commitment cost option for unique supply arrangements. And this is potentially a better approach than a blended fuel region, but we'll want to talk about the level of effort that goes into bringing this to fruition versus other alternative options. Let's go to the next slide. All right, a little bit on process. So again, we've got two buckets here, policy and something easier than the policy process. Most of what we've talked about already are going to fall under a policy process, meaning we need to talk about it in a stakeholder policy initiative, we need to do analysis, tariff changes. So those types of proposals include additional bidding flexibility in exceptional circumstances, changes to the manual reference level change request, and coming up with alternative options for cost adjustments. Now, on the process side, we have cyber changes that streamline automated reference level change requests. So this process might look a little bit different. It doesn't necessarily need to happen within the Gas Resource Management Policy Initiative, but we'll come up with opportunities to engage in that. And I'll talk about that more on the next slide. Go to the next slide. So process for developing process enhancements. First, some of the specifics that we heard around modifications to the automated reference level change request process. We heard that we should allow requests through cyber to be made at the fuel region level and update reference levels for all resources mapped to that fuel region. Also got a request that scheduling coordinators should be allowed to select multiple resources and request an adjustment for that group of resources at a time. So since this doesn't necessarily require an in-depth policy discussion, we're thinking as next steps, offering some education and testing in a testing environment where we can look at the tool and better understand your experience with it. And then from there, we'd be able to develop a sufficiently detailed request to send to the implementation teams. So we'll be requesting, or we'll be asking stakeholders who wants to engage in this process, who wants to better understand how cyber works for requesting automated reference level change requests, and get the ball rolling on scheduling that. Any questions about that?
Not seeing any questions at this time.
Cool. All right, next slide. Approaches that did not receive stakeholder support for immediate consideration. So these didn't get a lot of alignment, or stakeholders said this is something we're interested in, but not necessarily as a first choice or get done in the immediate future. And I'll go more into what we heard from stakeholders, but first to refresh everyone's memories. During the working group process, we talked about the potential to make modifications to the reasonableness threshold. So this would have required a comprehensive assessment of regular or everyday gas price volatility and could result in broad changes to threshold values, which requires a discussion of trade-offs. The next option that we talked about previously is use the right price. In other words, we would use different reference level values or different gas price values at different times of day. And implementing this would have been a pretty significant lift, a change to IT and business processes, and would have required justification as we went through an analysis. The next option is the blended fuel region methodology. This would be basically a canned methodology, something that's static and standardized, that could be useful for resources that draw fuel from multiple hubs. Finally, the market-based commitment costs. So in order to support a market-based commitment cost, we would need to develop a dynamic market power mitigation procedure, much like we subject energy bids to market power today, or to market power mitigation today. Detect market power exercise through commitment cost bids. This is a difficult task that we've attempted in the past, so we put it back out to stakeholders to see what you thought about it. Let's go to the next slide. So here are each of those ideas and why I've put it in the parking lot. Again, I'm bringing this to you now to make sure it's okay that these are in the parking lot and to open up comments to make sure that you have the opportunity to tell us that you want to elevate this as a priority or you want to codify a game plan to ensure that we come back to this eventually. So first on general modifications to the reasonableness threshold, we heard from SDG&E that this could be useful, but only insofar as more targeted options could not be identified. So we're thinking that reasonableness threshold adjustments under exceptional circumstances might fit that bill, but let us know. DMM similarly supports focus on targeted assessments, and they note that just simply increasing the reasonableness threshold may be inefficient. Finally, we did do an analysis during the working group process to see if a general modification was justified and haven't seen widespread issues under normal circumstances. So it seems logical to put this in the parking lot for now and focus in the near term on adjustments under exceptional circumstances. Under Use the Right Price, we received no stakeholder support. The ISO and DMM do acknowledge that this approach has the potential for improved outcomes, although the value of investing in those technology changes might be difficult to support. So in the near term, we're going to focus on enhancements to the automated reference level change request process, because this is the process that is the most flexible in allowing you to make changes to your reference levels, and you can do it on an hourly basis, which effectuates the same outcome as a more dynamic or like hourly reference level curve. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, blended fuel region methodology. We heard from DMM that different possible permutations of this might not be great. For example, using the highest cost fuel region as the blended fuel region methodology would disincentivize competitive behavior. DMM generally supports thinking about this and supports GAPI enhancements that could better reflect multiple fuel regions. We heard from Idaho that the NDEB is a good first step, but it does not extend to commitment costs. And they said this within the context of supporting or reconsidering the idea of a blended fuel region methodology, which could be applied to the commitment cost calculation. So I'm not fully taking this into the parking lot because we still want to compare it to a different option, which is the negotiated commitment cost option. A blended fuel region and providing a negotiated commitment cost option have different pros and cons when it comes to an investment in your time to develop the policy and investment in the ISO's time to develop the business process. So we'll talk about that further in the straw proposal. The last thing that I wanted to make sure you knew was in the parking lot was this idea of market-based commitment costs. Nevada does support moving in this direction. They say that efforts to build on the dynamic market power mitigation design developed through CCW such that it can support market-based commitment costs would be valuable. Nevada also acknowledged that this could take time and effort, and the ISO agrees with that evaluation. We think it makes sense to prioritize the other proposals that are on the table in the near term. And if this is something that continues to get attention, to make sure we discuss target conditions for revisiting this idea. So we're open to feedback on if you want to codify when we should come back to this, under what conditions we should, or if it should just go in the parking lot for now. And that's my last slide on cost adjustments and fuel cost volatility. Before we get to OFOs, I'll pause and see if anyone has questions or comments so far.
I'm not seeing any questions coming in at this moment.
Cool. Everyone's down with the game plan. Love that. All right, let's talk about OFOs. Go to the next slide. And the next slide. All right. Starting from the top once again, let's talk about the objectives that you've identified in your comments for efforts around managing gas burn limitations. We actually heard some broad and some specific requests and objectives here. One that I thought was interesting was a request to establish clear processes and expectations for gas resources that are trying to manage these gas burn limitations. Second, we heard from a lot of stakeholders that we should focus on efforts that can reflect gas pipeline conditions and reflect the price signal or the incentive intended by gas pipeline operators to maintain system balance. In other words, the price signal of an OFO in relevant electric price signals. And the last objective that I heard was to make sure that policy does not disincentivize resources from following pipeline instructions. And a possible click down to that last point might be that resources are really looking for clear recourse or a clear process to turn to when they're managing gas pipeline limitations, and they have to decide between following schedules in real time or risking these penalties. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so we heard pretty broad and clear stakeholder support that we should pursue a market-based approach that can help market participants more efficiently manage these gas burn limitations like OFOs. I do want to note that we've tried this before. We've gone through policy processes intended to figure out how to reflect OFOs in reference levels and in market prices, and have come across challenges that still need to be resolved if we want to move forward with policy development. That being said, I think that there's an opportunity in the near term to help get us through those challenges by focusing on targeted gas-electric coordination efforts. So that is where I think we should put our time in the near term so that we can get to a place where it's feasible to more fully develop these proposals around a market-based solution. Let's go to the next slide. This is described in a lot more detail in the issue paper. So you can always go back to the issue paper if you want to read about prior efforts that the ISO and stakeholders have engaged in to think about including these gas burn limitations and penalties in market prices. I did want to highlight a couple of lessons learned from those previous processes to give you an idea of why there are still challenges remaining and why this might take a minute to come up with an idea to resolve it. So a while back, the ISO did propose to allow resources to include OFOs or OFO penalties in their reference level calculations. FERC came back and said generators cannot reflect ex ante, meaning they can't put OFOs in their reference levels, and you can't recover OFO penalties after the fact, because this could mute the incentive that the penalty is there to provide, to follow gas pipeline operator instructions and support gas system reliability. So this is really just making sure that the incentive to preserve reliability is there. So the next idea that the ISO and stakeholders came up with was, what if we allow resources to reflect the risk of incurring a penalty? So not reflect the full penalty, but a potential, like an expected value of that penalty in their reference levels under certain predefined conditions where you might not be able to get more gas, or there's some trade-off between reliability risk to the electric system and the gas system. The direction we got from FERC is varied, some principle-based and some technical challenges. So on principle, DEBs, which are cost-based offers, should not reflect a generator's financial strategy or assumption of risk. So that crosses a line a bit if we're thinking about allowing a resource to reflect their perceived risk of incurring a penalty. Next, FERC requested that the ISO give them an idea or a specific example of what supporting documentation would indicate that risk value, and we didn't have anything. Finally, the ISO and stakeholders, FERC told us that the ISO and stakeholders would need to prove that whatever methodology we used we could guarantee wouldn't pose a reliability risk to the gas system. So one final go around with this was actually before all of those, where DMM wrote a white paper in 2014 thinking about how the ISO could calculate some scarcity value or could incorporate OFOs into reference levels. And the challenge that they found with this is that the ISO doesn't have sufficient visibility into how specific resources are situated on a gas pipeline in terms of their relativity to other generators, how much they've nominated versus how much they have burned or intend to burn, and how actions might impact efficiency and reliability outcomes. And so without that visibility into the full picture of incentives and prices, it just wouldn't be possible for the ISO to calculate a number that accurately reflects the situation. With all that in mind, and again, I encourage you to go back to the issue paper, which talks about all of this in more detail and describes additional key takeaways that might be helpful as you're thinking about solutioning in this area. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide. Okay, so something that we've found that works really well in the past is taking time to invest in gas-electric coordination efforts. And in particular, we have found that this is a necessary bridge that facilitates market-based solutions today. And as an example, I want to take some time to talk about how gas-electric coordination with gas pipelines that serve CAISO BA resources allows us to reflect gas system conditions in the electricity market through two different avenues. So first, the ISO provides gas burn reports based on forward-looking market results to these gas pipeline operators. And this does a number of things. One, it ensures that there is sufficient gas pipeline capacity in real time to meet expected commitments. Two, it allows gas pipeline operators to take proactive measures. They use that information, they compare it to the nominations that they've already received for gas pipeline capacity, and if it doesn't align, that allows them to proactively issue, for example, OFOs. And this is why for CAISO BA resources, the ISO understands OFOs are issued in advance and are captured in next day gas day prices. What we've heard from stakeholders is that there's a challenge around OFOs in real time because we can't capture those in gas and electric market prices, but OFOs captured in advance are a little bit easier. The second area where this is helpful has been in initiating and activating gas constraint nomograms, where the gas system operator is the one that specifies the applicable zone and the conditions for activating a constraint. So gas electric coordination is a necessary step for setting up a gas constraint nomogram. If you take away anything from this slide, I think it should be that gas electric coordination is important if you want a clear and somewhat accurate price signal to manage gas system limitations in the electric market. We need sufficient information. It needs to be dynamic. It needs to be timely. And the gas system operator, and we need to guarantee that it aligns with the incentives intended by the gas system operator. So as a baseline, I think that through this policy initiative, we should think about targeted gas electric coordination efforts that gets us to at least where we have opportunities, the same opportunities that are available for CAISO BA resources. But let's go to the next slide. Thinking forward, this is the ultimate goal. Stakeholders have recommended approaches to capture gas limitations in price formation. So this is where we want to end up eventually. SRP recommended improving pricing, matching constraints with specific resources, aligning GPI with gas pipeline conditions. Nevada recommended that we use a constraint to create a price signal that indicates how much up or downward capacity is available. And we heard from SRP and PAC to consider how to reflect the costs of managing gas burn limitations in the default energy bid. And specifically, we might consider an opportunity cost component. So if you compare these to the list of lessons learned a couple of slides ago, you'll note that there are a number of possible challenges that we still need to overcome and prove to regulators we can overcome. So we didn't want to take these off the table because of those challenges, especially because stakeholders seem to prioritize this highly and have a good idea of where they want to go. So instead, I am going to propose including these in the straw proposals so that we can systematically think through what next steps in gas electric coordination will get us there. Let's go to the next slide. We also heard from stakeholders requests for clarity around expected behavior and a need to better characterize the potential risks or types of situations that market participants might be in. For example, how their specific situation on a pipeline might impact their choices for managing imbalances, whether a gas resource is expected to or already anticipates disregarding pipeline instructions, whether gas resources are facing unavoidable reliability risks. And a couple of calls to action here that I've pulled out from stakeholder comments. One stakeholder recommended that we provide guidelines for EIM and EDAM BAs that want to initiate the development of a gas nomogram constraint, define circumstances and relevant regional pipeline practices that create inefficient outcomes or unavoidable risks, and establish clear processes for expectations around managing intraday gas system limitations using tools available today. In other words, we're looking at immediate clarity and a defined process for what we can do in the near term. And I've stolen this idea from ISO New England. They have a great document called A User's Guide for Managing Gas System Limitations. So I see this as a partner to considering proposals, where we would develop a user's guide to address these immediate requests, point to tools that you can use today to manage gas system limitations, and also use that as a springboard to further develop the policy proposals on the previous slide and identify necessary gas-electric coordination efforts. Let's go to the next slide. This is a final piece of the puzzle here where we heard some stakeholder recommended problem statement analysis. For instance, stakeholders would like to know the frequency with which there is insufficient gas in real time to meet day-ahead market awards. This might be useful for us to assess the potential for true reliability risk versus a risk of inefficiency or high prices. We've heard a need to assess the frequency and degree of real-time imbalances, how often you receive notifications from gas pipelines, how stringent those restrictions are. One stakeholder recommended looking at a correlation between OFOs and high demand. Be useful to know, better understand the context around that and what that's going to tell us. And one stakeholder recommended thinking about looking at the risk of being dispatched higher after being mitigated, which I think is an interesting point where stakeholders have cited the risk of mitigation as a reason why they might not be able to follow the gas pipeline instruction, but you're not always mitigated. So this would be a good trick to understand when we're thinking about the stakeholders. And we'll be looking for and more context around these analysis areas. Okay, so now I'm going to tie this all together. Let's go to the next slide. I'm hoping this is not an unsatisfactory response to all of the stakeholder proposals we got on trying to capture gas burn limitations as a price signal in the market. The plan is to take these three, I guess, workflows, developing a user's guide, categorizing these stakeholder proposals, and investing some time in an analysis, and using those to identify our gas electric coordination goals. These are the things that we need to do, the types of coordination that we need to engage in order to get us to a place where we can feasibly develop a market-based tool. In other words, I'm not kicking the can down the lane. I have a game plan and a to-do list for the rest of the year. So I have gotten feedback that this is a lot of information and potentially a lot to digest. So this slide deck is on our stakeholder page. If there's anything you want me to go back to now and explain, let me know. But let me just conclude with like a level set of expectations. At this point, this is what we think is going into the straw proposal, but we want to give you an opportunity to comment on it before going full speed ahead. So let us know if you have seen anything here that you disagree with, if you have different priorities, if there's something you want us to account for, or if you'd like to add to one of your proposals and make sure it gets into the straw proposal in more detail. We'll have that opportunity for you before publishing a straw proposal sometime next month.
Do you have a hand raised right now by Lindsay?
Hi, Lindsay. Go for it.
Sylvie, Lindsay Schluckler with NV Energy. I am reacting to this real time, so haven't fully thought through my question, but I was hoping you could provide a little bit more insight into the game plan here, how you plan on taking through all of the user's guide, the proposals, and the problem analysis, and kind of like a timeline of how we would develop the market-based tool. And I guess, does CAISO anticipate there being a tool to help us resolve this issue, or I guess will we just see throughout the stakeholder process and kind of like a timeline of how we think this would develop?
Great questions. So near term, how I see this playing out is that the user's guide is something that the CAISO or my team can take on to initiate, where we can clearly spell out what we expect from you, the different types of OFOs, and the risks that we've heard so far. The stakeholder proposals is something that we've already gotten from you to some extent, so we'll include that in the straw proposal and offer opportunities throughout this year for you to extrapolate on that and add detail. And then our analysis team is also working on an analysis, so we can talk about that. So those, I think, are 3 fairly doable objectives for this year. And we would use those as a basis to identify what happens next. So what gas electric coordination efforts we need to do in order to effectuate those stakeholder proposals. Let's see if I can think of anything off the top of my head. So for instance, in order to create a constraint that translates to a price signal to indicate how much upward or downward capacity is available. The potential next step for gas electric coordination would be establishing a relationship with the relevant gas pipeline and a protocol for what information needs to be shared in order for the ISO to implement that type of constraint. So that's one example of a target gas electric coordination goal that we might set at the end of this year. So I envision that by the end of this year, we would have a set of goals, a set of things that we need to do in order to then develop those market-based tools. And so to answer your final question, do we expect that there is a market-based tool that can do this? Well, I hope so, because there's strong support for it, and there's no reason not to think about this given given how stakeholders have expressed the potential value of it. There's just challenges that we need to overcome to get there. So this is my game plan for figuring out which of those challenges can be resolved before figuring out what direction we can go in for the market-based tool. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think that's very helpful. Also, I noticed in the slides there was feedback from previous proposals where FERC maybe disallowed certain proposals to occur with the market just based on, I think it was participant level information fed into like a market-based tool, and that's why you're working more on a solution that would work with the pipeline. Are you seeing this as only being something that would be developed with the pipeline? And if so, then do we need to have the pipelines involved in like this kind of stakeholder process?
I would say a tentative yes. I see gas electric coordination as a necessary step to make this happen. Yeah, in which case, yes, the gas pipelines would need to be engaged. Uncertain in what process or venue they would need to be engaged. And I say that because gas electric coordination is sort of a hot topic and is always a hot topic in different venues. FERC and NASB and IRC are always talking about gas electric coordination efforts. These conversations also happen at a BA and a local level. So coming up with the correct venue might be a discussion that we'll have, but I do see a need to get gas pipeline operators to come to the table in some way.
Okay, this was very helpful. I was just trying to gauge kind of, I guess, additional thoughts of kind of what CAISO was thinking on this. So this is helpful. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the questions.
And I'm not seeing any other hands raised at this moment. Did you have any other final thoughts, Sylvie, before we move on to next steps?
That's all from me. I think everyone could use a little break and a moment to let this digest, so I'll stop for now.
Thank you. Could we go to oh, we just got one more question actually from Ryan.
Hi there, this is Ryan Sarai from the Public Advocate's Office at the CPUC. I was just wondering, and maybe this is already covered in prior materials for this working group, so excuse me for maybe missing it, but does the CAISO know when you're going to publish a straw proposal for the GRM working group, like when the timeline might be to receive the straw proposal?
That's on me. I should have included a schedule in this slide deck. The target publication for a straw proposal is end of May at some time. That is assuming we don't hear from stakeholders that what I've represented here is significantly off base from what they expected. But assuming we hear from stakeholders that this looks like a great game plan, the ISO has already started to work on that straw proposal and do a preliminary assessment. So we're targeting May.
Yeah, and no worries. I believe there was a schedule, now that I'm thinking about it, for next steps in the issue paper that was distributed.
Yes.
Oh, hey, there it is. Okay. Well, thank you.
Anytime.
Thank you. So yeah, for next steps, as Sylvie mentioned, straw proposal target publication in May, and then stakeholder comments are due April 30th. The comment template will be up shortly, and if you have any other questions that come up, you can always email us at isostakeholderaffairs@caiso.com. Next slide, please. One more slide, please. Thank you. And now just a quick announcement before we wrap up. For insights into the ISO grid and market operations, be on the lookout for our Energy Matters blog, or you can resubscribe. And with that, we'd like to thank you so much for joining today's call. As a reminder, this meeting was recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, and the video file will be posted on the initiative webpage. We thank you very much, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Inteller Event Services. You may now disconnect.